I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about the latest and greatest in U.S. China relations, we have with us one of the eminent observers of all things U.S. China. Of course, that is Jane Perlez, a longtime foreign correspondent for the New York Times, who served as the Beijing bureau chief in China for the Times until 2019. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who's focused on China's foreign policy, in particular its relations with the United States and its Asian neighbors. She's also former longtime just foreign policy reporter for the Times, and she is currently a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School's Belfer Center. And I got to tell you all, the host of a terrific new podcast called Face Off, the U.S. versus China. Jane, so great to have you here.
Well, very good to be with you, Andrew. Always loved talking to you over the years.
Absolutely. So I want to get right into it. But first, tell me about your podcast and like what you're doing with it, because it's exciting.
Yeah, I think so. We were very lucky to get backing from the Carnegie Corporation. So we have done 8 episodes. It's called Face Off, U.S. versus China. And we've taken an approach which I hope will please a general audience, people who feel that they should know more about China. Didn't want to get too far down into the weeds. So we have very lively guests. And then we have Rana Mitter, who's a professor of all things China at the Kennedy School, analyze things with me after our main interview. It's a lively podcast that covers the South China Sea, Apple's manufacturing in China, and how that marriage between Apple and the Communist Party, 2 of the most secretive organizations in the world, how that's faring at the moment, not too well. And we deal with the economy, and we deal with Taiwan. And for a little interlude, we have a great interview with Yo-Yo Ma.
Hey, you can't beat that, right?
Not at all. He's the most charming person in the entire world. I realized 5 minutes into that interview, which we did in person in a studio at Harvard, why he's one of the world's superstars, the most charming person.
That's amazing. Well, I know our listeners are going to dive right into all that. But in the meantime, let's talk about the U.S. and China. How has the relationship developed over the last couple years in your judgment?
Well, I have to say, as you mentioned, I went out as a correspondent for the New York Times in 2012. And I always like to tell this story. That's a bit longer than the few years you mentioned, but I think it's worth telling because in 2012, Valentine's Day, actually, there was this big lunch at the State Department in the Ben Franklin room, 200 people, all the who's who of anything to do with China and US. Bob Zoellick, Kevin Rudd, the former American diplomats, Winston Lord, and Henry Kissinger, everybody who'd been and had anything to do with China, and they were all smiling from ear to ear, not because it was Valentine's Day, but because Xi Jinping was up on the podium and he was still the vice president, but everyone knew he was going to be the leader. And they all thought he was going to continue in the same path, reformer. Well, how wrong could they be? And as our guest on our show about the Biden-Xi Jinping relation points out, we should never have made that mistake because even Xi Jinping's comrades on the standing committee really don't know him that well. It's very hard for the Chinese top politicians to really know each other, although they probably knew that he was not going to be the reformer that the Americans thought he was going to be. And then fast forward to 2017, Xi Jinping did away with the barriers to third term. He became what we jokingly call, but it's not joke, emperor for life. And he instituted this really quite authoritarian regime that he is now head of. I think in part because he really has an ambition for China. He wants China to be the leader in the Pacific, Asia Pacific. He wants it to replace the United States there. I'm not sure that he wants to be a global power. Some people think so, but certainly he wants to be the power in Asia. And that's at the heart, I think, of the huge difficulties now between Washington and Beijing. It's just head-on competition. The United States wants to stay. China wants to replace it.
This might be, interesting to our listeners. Why do you say that the Chinese themselves have a hard time really knowing who Xi is?
Because the Communist Party in China, it's got 90 million members, by the way. I mean, that's more people than in Germany.
Yep.
But the top tier, it's a very secretive organization, as I understand it. So there are 7 members of the Standing Committee, which is the ruling body, and from whom the next president is always chosen. And as I understand it, they have to make appointments, formal appointments with each other to talk to each other. I mean, it's a very siloed, very controlled situation. And allegedly, this appointment process is because they don't want factions to build. It's kind of an anti-faction move, apparently, but it certainly makes the leader, if he wants to be, very walled off like this.
And why do you think relations between the US and China are steadily deteriorating?
Well, I think in part, I think it's a lot of fear, probably on both sides. But I think particularly in the United States, if I could say, I think there's a lot of fear that China, this huge economy, which is in the doldrums at the moment, but is probably going to revive. I mean, for what it's worth, I don't believe that China has peaked. You know, they can turn on a dime if they want to. I think there's a lot of fear that China will overtake the United States in this new geopolitical realm because now it's China and Russia combined against the United States. So that's a big counterweight against the United States. And they are very committed to being the power in Asia. And the Biden administration has really doubled down on reinforcing America's allies in Asia. And I think on the Chinese side, that creates a lot of fear. They don't like that at all. So on both sides, there's a big fear component.
And is the fear really centered on armed conflict or is it centered on economic conflict?
Both, I think.
Let's talk about armed conflict. Where do you see that?
Well, first of all, we should say that China is increasing its nuclear arsenal very purposefully, and I don't know about speed, but they're very determined to do so under Xi Jinping. This is a new policy. So they're catching up with the United States on the number of nuclear weapons, and they're digging silos in Xinjiang as we speak to accommodate that increase in weapons. And then I think that on the military side, the Biden reinforcement of the alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia is very worrying to the Chinese. And also militarily, just to go back to the Chinese side, they now have a bigger navy than the United States. And this can show itself up in the South China Sea,
Yep.
which they claim 90% of.
And they continue to roam and build and patrol and scare all the neighbors.
And particularly in the Philippines right now, they are more than harassing. I mean, they're really doubling down on the Filipinos who have a small garrison on a tiny island in the South China Sea, which the Philippines claims, and the Chinese are trying to stop the resupply of that garrison. And they're using incredibly fierce Coast Guard vessels to hose down water cannons to hose down the Filipino supply vessels. So that's a trigger point, and the Philippines, because of that, they've always been an ally, but they've drawn closer to the United States. And if there was another incident in the air, like there was in 2001, when a Chinese fighter jet collided with an American spy plane, and the American spy plane staggered onto Hainan Island with the crew intact, 24 crew intact, that unhappy situation was resolved quite well and relatively quickly after 11 days. The United States got its crew back in 11 days. I think people think if that happened today, there would be no such easy solution. And if, God forbid, the American crew went down and was drowned, there would be a huge competition between American vessels and Chinese vessels to get to the site of the crash. And the Chinese vessels, because they outnumber ours, could prevent the Americans from getting to the site of the crash. It could be very, very nasty.
Yeah, that's really instructive when you think about it in those terms. And that's really the perspective that you've always brought with your reporting on these issues.
Well, if I could just say a small thing here, there's nothing like being a reporter on the ground. And I was very fortunate with my colleagues to be a reporter in Beijing and all of China from 2012 to 2019. But now, Andrew, there are very few American reporters in China, and people forget this.
That's right.
And we're getting much less firsthand reporting from China. Why? Because the Trump administration kicked out almost 60 Chinese reporters from state-run media organizations like Xinhua, People's Daily, etc., knowing full well that the Chinese would retaliate against us. So instead of 10 reporters in China, as as in 2019, the New York Times now has two. The
Right. It's
Washington Post
amazing.
has zero, zero. The Wall Street Journal has three compared to 23 a few years ago.
So, I mean, that is a great point. It compounds the fact that we don't understand each other. They don't have anyone here to cover here. And let's face it, they're pretty good reporters themselves.
Right.
And we don't have anybody there. So we're really missing a lot.
I think so. I think it's a big deficit. Now, the Trump administration says that some of the people for Xinhua, et cetera, were actually intelligence officers. Well, maybe they were writing, screeds back to MSS, analytical stuff, but it was probably not worth the paper it was written on. And it's not as though these people were active spies. And anyway, my argument would be better to have these people in front of you so you can see what they're interested in
That's right.
rather than putting them out of the country and putting us, the American reporters, at a deficit, which is now the case.
Really a problem. And let's get into the issue basically of, recent this week. Biden administration's decision to heighten tariffs on Chinese EVs and solar panels. And how is this going to impact the U.S. China economic relationship? This seems like a pretty bold step.
Right. I talked to a really interesting American business person who's up at Harvard these days. His name is Mitch Presnick, and he founded an amazing business in China, Hotel Eights. It was a chain of more than 1,000 hotels, which he sold last year. But he spent more than 30 years in China, so he really knows both sides. And he thinks that the tariffs yesterday or this week, basically good old-fashioned protection for the American auto industry, just as there was good old-fashioned protection to the U.S. steel industry, and we know what happened to that.
Right.
So who knows how helpful this is? I think Biden hopes it's very helpful to his election chances in Wisconsin and Michigan. But is it going to really stimulate the big auto manufacturers to get into the EV business? Not clear.
Yeah, maybe, maybe not. I mean, the thing that I keep asking my colleagues here at CSIS, and I think we do another podcast called The Trade Guys with Bill Reinsch and Scott Miller, and I keep asking them, okay, so say China was able to sell EVs here. It seems to me that that would be a high stigma thing for an American to actually buy a Chinese car. To which they responded, well, 10, 15 years ago, nobody wanted to drive a Korean car either. So if China's making good cars and they're cheaper and they're EVs, who knows? So maybe there's, really something to this beyond the politics of Wisconsin and Michigan.
Yeah, I have to say, I do think that there's something about a $10,000 BYD, which actually the New York Times reporter Keith Bradshaw, who's a great reporter on cars, he was Detroit bureau chief for years, and now he's in
Yeah,
China. So he knows this EV stuff cold. I mean, he's been writing about how these BYD vehicles are really state of the art in terms of design, interiors, down to the sheen on the outside. I mean, the whole thing. So if they were allowed in here, who knows? They'd probably be pretty popular.
could
And
be.
who knows? Why wouldn't, if you allowed them in, maybe they would give a prod to Detroit to come up with something similar. But I know that's very unfashionable to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, all we talk about these days is economic competition with China. And you hear that so much that it almost, it seems trite at this point, but it's really not because this is the future of national security, don't you think?
You mean what part do you think's the
Well, the
future?
economic security component of it, we're constantly talking about this competition with China as the real, idea that's arming national security decisions these days.
America's national security in the future is going to depend, and China's is going to depend on the future of tech and the future of AI and advanced semiconductors. And so the Biden administration keeps talking about the high fence, small yard, or the Jake Sullivan phrase. But basically, did a Pearl Harbor October 7th 2022 when they banned the export of America's high-end semiconductors to China. And that really laid down where we were going. And that was an effort to try and stop China producing advanced military equipment, advanced all the things that need those advanced chips. And who knows how long that's going to work for? I mean, maybe it's going to work for 5 years, 10 years, but there are some people who think that by banning those advanced semiconductors, that you're actually stimulating the Chinese to work harder, be more creative, and come up with things faster. And maybe that will be the case.
Well, and at the least, they're what, a year and a half behind?
Yeah, some people say 5 years, but I mean, who knows? I suspect it's a fairly subjective judgment. And I'd love to know how this can be measured.
True. Well, speaking of AI, the U.S. and China also this week opened talks in Geneva. So while at the same time, the administration is putting heavy tariffs on China. And by the way, we should say this is a bipartisan thing. If there's one thing Democrats and Republicans agree on in Washington, it's that neither of them like China very much. And it's politically chic to, put these tariffs on and see who can be tougher on China. But at the same time, the United States and China open talks this week in Geneva about AI risks. And what are the issues that the two sides are discussing? And do you think that this is important and real cooperation between the two nations?
Well, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, the one area that I know a little about is the question of whether AI should be permitted in the command and control of nuclear weapons. I think there's a lot of fear that human control of nuclear weapons, the ultimate weapon, could be handed over to AI, and that should be stopped at all costs. That that's one thing that should not be allowed. And I think if they can lay the groundwork for that, that would be excellent. But I'm a little dubious about how far these talks are going to go. I mean, I think it's great that they've started, but I just hope that they're not kind of a holding pattern or designed as a show that, oh, we're doing something with the Chinese. We're talking about AI, but nothing much is. I hope it's more than discussion, and I hope it really does lead to some control over AI and nuclear weapons. To me, that's the most important part of it.
Jane, I want to move on to the thing that's looming really large in the United States, and that is the upcoming presidential elections in next November. What do you see through the prism of U.S. China vis-a-vis these elections?
Well, I think there's a lot of discussion about this. I think that the Chinese, like everybody else, is trying to scope out the Trump side and to figure out who's going to come in with Trump. Personally, I think there's this kind of fake, mistaken belief that if he comes in with some more reasonable people, then maybe he'll be more reasonable. But I think his 4-year tenure has shown that he's his own boss. And Fiona Hill can speak very well to that. I mean, he just is his own person. So I don't think it matters much who he brings in. I think that's wishful thinking, but the Chinese are very diligent about doing their homework. And if I may say, they know a lot more about us because they're so diligent than we know about them. In part, it's a little bit of a language problem because we don't have enough people who speak Chinese. But I think in the long run, Beijing fears Biden more. Why? Because I think Biden and his people are very serious about continuing to trying to contain China with a ring of allies around Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia. I thought that AUKUS, I grew up in Australia, so I know a little bit about it. And I've always thought that AUKUS was never going to happen. But I did ask a Chinese visitor a couple of weeks ago what Beijing thought of AUKUS. And he said, well, they don't really like it very much. And this is someone who's pretty well informed because of the Pillar Two, which is the high-tech stuff that combines Britain, Australia, and the United States. So if that does take off, and if Japan has, more is leaning more into the alliance, and South Korea too, I think that's a long-term worry for Beijing, which Trump wouldn't do. I mean, who knows? He may ditch all the alliances.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So they're nervous because they see clear intentions of the Biden administration to shore up our Pacific allies to contain China. And what they've seen from Trump in the past is that he is constantly trying to shake up our alliances and change the nature of them.
Maybe even abandon them. I mean, he said at times, I mean, I don't think he said it about, I think at times he said, goodbye South Korea or goodbye Japan. He doesn't have a feel for the alliances as Biden does. Also, I think the Chinese are pretty good at figuring out Trump. They know that he's vain. They know that he's an egomaniac, and they will try in some ways to appeal to that. I mean, it's only a small anecdote, but it does show how they really understand him. When he made a state visit to Beijing, I think it was 2017, they organized the best show on earth for him. They opened up the secret places of the Forbidden City and showed him all the gold treasures. No American president had been in there because they weren't as vain, they weren't as. So the Chinese are very good at calculating Trump and trying to please him, and I can see that meaning something. But at the same time, what will Trump do about the China-Russia alignment? Trump probably doesn't care about it that much. I mean, it's really worrying to the current White House. Trump will probably just, let that go.
Looking ahead, what do you see with the evolving U.S. China relationship? Do you think it deteriorates further? Do you think, I mean, obviously, a lot of this depends on the election, as we've just talked about, but there is some trajectory that you can sort of see here, and it doesn't feel like it's going in the right direction.
I agree with you. I think in part also, this may sound quite a little bit corny or quite simple, but I think it's quite serious. The impetus for Americans to go to China is now very, very low. The Chinese have arrested people who are working for Chinese businesses. That's a big turnoff. The surveillance is very severe. I have friends who were outside the Forbidden City a couple of months ago at 11 o'clock at night, and security came up and said, "What are you doing here?" And they just said, "Well, we're taking a walk after a late dinner." And the security guy whipped out his phone and he could track exactly where they'd been in the last 20 minutes. And most seriously, the number of young Americans who are going to China to learn the language is way down. And it seems there's talk about increasing the number, but there's not a lot being done about it. And I think that's a serious factor. So I feel as though we may well be back in a old Cold War style relationship, which doesn't do anybody any good, even though the economic relations will, of course, be far different to what it was between the Soviet Union and the United States. And I also think that no one should underestimate the Chinese economy. I mean, people in Washington are, maybe licking their lips or, chortling, oh, the Chinese economy is in trouble at the moment, and they've got 90 million unfinished apartments, which is enough for the population of Germany to fill. But there are ways they can solve that real estate problem if they decide to take a slight detour. I mean, it's not an insoluble problem. So I think that people should be wary about underestimating the skills of the Chinese Communist Party in sort of, what can I say, making sure that the economy doesn't go too far down. And so whether the economy goes down, that's not great for the United States in many respects, but if it comes back and is a full-throated Chinese economy, people in Washington are not going to be happy with that either. So either way you look at it, I don't think it's great times ahead, particularly with the alignment with Russia. I think that's a very disturbing factor. And they
Is
seem
that
to
one
be.
of the key things you're really focused on right now, looking at going forward?
We'll see what comes out of the Putin Xi visit this week, but it does seem as though China is helping Russia a great deal in the war in Ukraine. And if Ukraine goes down, in part because of Chinese help with the Russian military and the Russian economy, that will sour the American-Chinese relationship even more.
Jane, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for all this insight. And for our listeners, you can hear Jane's insight regularly on the podcast Face Off, US versus China. Jane, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Great thrill to be talking to you about this.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.